We are now going to finish up Unit 5, or most of Unit 5, by discussing the Haitian Revolution and the Spanish and Latin American revolutions, and then we'll quickly touch upon the Mexican-American War. So Haiti, otherwise known as Saint-Domingue, was a French colony. Just taking a quick look at this map, France is up here in Europe. This is Britain. Spain is right below France, and then Portugal at the end here. This is Africa down on the right side. And then this is the United States, North America, and this is Florida. This island is Cuba, and down here is Haiti. And this area here is the Aztec Empire in modern-day Mexico. So the Haitian Revolution is the third of the Atlantic revolutions, the third to take place, and it started in 1791, a couple years after the beginning of the French Revolution. And a few things about this territory. French Saint-Domingue was the world's richest colony in mainly sugar and coffee, producing about 50%, which is a pretty impressive number for something so addictive. Coffee is really important because slaves are not, generally speaking, nourished very properly, and they're generally speaking overworked physically, so they're tired. And coffee is really helpful in keeping slaves working really, really hard and long hours. The population of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, was about 500,000 African slaves, and there was extremely high turnover, meaning so many of those slaves died on a regular basis that they were constantly needing to pull in new slaves from Africa. So very few people there, few of the African slaves were born in Haiti. Most of them kept being brought over and dying, so they kept needing a lot of new slaves. There were about 40,000 white colonists, and they were divided into two social strata, the Grand and Petite Blancs. Blanc is white. So the wealthy and the poorer white people. And then there were 30,000 gens de couleur, meaning free black men who had gained freedom somehow, and either were colonizers or at least owned their own plantations that they worked on and had people working on as well. There are a few clips. We will watch these in class. If you look at the PowerPoint, you are welcome, and I would encourage you to click on these clips and watch them before class so that you know what's coming. Toussaint Louverture was a black man who had become free. He was a former slave who had managed to become free, and he was the leader of the Haitian Revolution, which eventually was successful, and it was the only successful slave revolt. He led his forces against not just the French, but also British and other foreign troops that tried to come in and take over. Very, very impressive, very formidable. To go against Napoleon and win is kind of shocking. Haiti became a post-slavery republic, meaning all black people as a republic had a right to vote and became citizens. However, there was a lot of economic inequality. What did this mean? The gens de couleur, the 30,000 gens de couleur, the 30,000 black men who had owned plantations or land prior to the revolution, continued their position in power and had economic and social and political influence way above the 500,000 slaves who had been freed. And this independence debt is a humongous problem that has lasting repercussions, I think, to today. This independence debt basically meant that the Haitians, who were former slaves, had to pay back the white French plantation owners for property meaning human slaves. And this led to 80% of the gross domestic product being sent over to France on a regular basis until 1947, 140 plus years of Haitians paying back and paying money towards the French government with up to 80% of their income until 1947. Today, Haiti has severe economic, political, and social challenges, and I have to think that this stems directly from the extreme poverty that they were forced upon because of this very strange philosophy that the Haitian former slaves owed the French money for freeing themselves. Kind of very, very strange. This also, this meaning the Haitian Revolution, also increased the number of slaves in Cuba because people realized that they couldn't have slaves in Haiti, so they moved the location to Cuba, which, as we saw on the map a moment ago, is the next island over, very close in location, and Cuba also has a lot of territory that is suitable for plantations and for mining. And that's where a lot of slaves ended up being taken instead of Haiti. This image, I think, is pretty interesting. It's called Revenge Taken by the Black Army. Who do you think made this image? Was it a newly freed black person, or was it a French person? Well, let's look at a few of the things that we see here. These people here on the left side on the bottom, these black men, are hanging this French soldier. And up here there's another French soldier, a commander, based on his uniform. He's being hung. And all along in the mountains here are all other French military men being hung. These men arrived on the island of Haiti to put down the slave insurrection, and they were overcome. These black people down here, these former slaves probably, don't look super excited. They almost look a little bit sad, in my opinion, because they're not, you don't see teeth, they're not smiling. But they're doing something that is considered perhaps necessary. It's revenge taken by the Black Army. On the other hand, you kind of feel maybe some sympathy for the French guys being hung up. This guy is probably still alive, and his toes are pointed gracefully, and he doesn't look like he's trying to squirm around or struggle, and he still has his sword, which is perhaps more of a metaphor or a representation than a reality. And up here, this guy is in perfect uniform, and he looks so noble and graceful as he's being hung, which is kind of unreal to think about. And these guys, the black men, don't look like they are evil or that they are, I don't know, like trying to do something bad or wrong. They're just taking revenge. So it's likely that the artist of this image perhaps felt some sympathy for the Africans, however, was definitely on the side of the French because of how graceful the French military men look in this image, and kind of how horrifying it is to see all of these gallows, all of these people being hung on the hill, which in reality I'm not sure how often this would be done, because that's a lot of work. Instead, you'd probably make a couple of these, hang one person, then cut them down and hang the next person. At the same time, this is a lot of important imagery here. It shows the strength of the Black Army, so to speak, and the fact that they won this incredible revolution against a colonial power, which was shocking to the world. It was so shocking, and it frightened whites in other regions so much that it really led to severe punishments for any small insurrection. No slave could do anything, could breathe funny or look at their owner in the wrong way without getting punished in the most corporal ways, whippings, public, very physical, and it was meant to show and to scare slaves into submission. This map shows the years where these nations became independent. So up here in white you see Haiti in 1804. It finally gained its independence, which again was the first and only slave revolt that really was successful. And it wasn't for many more years, around 15 years, for the other Spanish territories, for almost all of the other Spanish territories to gain independence. And the Portuguese territory of Brazil didn't gain independence till 1822. And then the purple countries were remaining colonies after 1830, both Spanish and British, French, and Dutch colonies that were still dependent after 1830. Kind of almost shocking to think about. Okay, so the Louisiana Purchase. This territory in blue, right in the middle, is territory that Napoleon sold to America in 1803. And originally this territory was French, and then the French gave it to the Spanish, the allies of the French after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And Napoleon took it back from the Spanish. And then after the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon, who had wanted to expand his territory in North America, kind of started freaking out because a lot of this territory was slave territory. And Napoleon didn't feel like he had the capacity to handle so much territory in North America, especially slave territory, especially after the Haitian Revolution. So he sold this whole chunk of land to America. Thomas Jefferson was our president at the time, and Jefferson went into negotiations with France because he wanted New Orleans down here, because he wanted access to the Mississippi River so that trade could be conducted along the river. As we know, things can be floated along a river very, very easily, and it's a wonderful way to save money rather than carrying goods over land. You stick it on a flat piece of something and it floats down a river down to New Orleans where it could be shipped off across the seas. So Thomas Jefferson went to negotiate purchasing New Orleans and surrounding territory to gain access to that Mississippi River, and instead he came home with this humongous chunk of territory, the whole Louisiana Purchase. He bought each acre for 3 pennies, which basically was like buying California for $5, in other words. And it was considered unconstitutional to purchase this land, and it was really harshly fought against by a lot of people who were abolitionists who did not want to continue slavery, but a lot of people liked the idea, especially southern slave-owning states. They liked the idea of gaining more territory because a lot of it was already slave land, and they wanted to expand their business, their slave-owning business, and what other way would be good to do that as opposed to purchasing and expanding land in the West. So what a crazy thing to think about. 3 cents an acre. Unbelievable. Okay, the Spanish-American Revolutions. They lasted around 15 years, from around 1810 till 1825. And when we say Spanish-American Revolutions, it's in regard to the place south of our border, basically, starting with Mexico all the way down south into South America. There was Creole resentment of Spanish and Portuguese rule and taxes, and the people were not united. What does that mean? The Creoles, first of all, again, we've already talked about this, but the Creoles are people who are born in the Americas but have Spanish or Portuguese blood. They have descended from the Spanish or Portuguese, but they were born in the Americas. So they're considered Creoles. They are the elite living in South and Mesoamerica, Middle America, and below. And they are the elite. They have the power and the influence under those from Spain and Portugal themselves. And they are still tied to the Spanish and Portuguese crowns. And they have taxes that they have to send overseas because they are part of the colonies of the Spanish and Portuguese. They resented the royal rule from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain and Portugal, but they were not united. It wasn't a group of people coming together saying, let's figure out a way to gain freedom. It was each Creole or many Creoles independently thinking about ways to gain independence and to get rid of their overseers, to overthrow the crown from in the colonies in America, or the Americas. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain and Portugal and got rid of the royalty there. He deposed the King of Spain and made the King of Portugal flee to the Brazilian colony. And this led to a political vacuum. There was no head of state in Spain or in Portugal, and this created a lot of chaos. And people in the colonies, especially those Creoles, ended up demanding independence because they realized there wasn't a king to lead them. There was chaos, and they saw what was happening in other parts of the world with other revolutions and wanted in on that revolutionary cycle. They wanted independence. However, unfortunately, in some ways, for Latin America, there were a lot of racial, class, and ideological divisions, meaning there were different groups of races. There were people who had descended from Africa, there were indigenous Native Americans, and there were people from Spain and Portugal, mestizos as well, mixed race people. And all of these different races also had or belonged to different classes. There were very wealthy people who had a little bit more influence, and there were very, very poor peons, lower class people who had very little influence, were not landowners, had no money, had no say, and ideological divisions, meaning different philosophies on how people should be ruled, how governments should be created, and how laws should be followed and kept. So there was no mass revolutionary movement. There wasn't one united group fighting for a revolution. Simón Bolívar was one man who did try to unite a big group of people, and he led this idea of united nativism, and he called people Americanos. If you were born in Latin America, in Mexico and down south of Mexico, you were considered an Americano. This could be a Creole, someone of purely Spanish or Portuguese blood descent, or it could be someone who was born as a Native American from America, or it could be someone of African descent, or any level of mestizo, any mixed race person. And this was also including different classes, wealthy and poor. Anyone who was born in the Americas was considered an Americanos. And this was an attempt at fighting against the Spanish royalty, against the monarchy, to gain independence for Latin American people. Unfortunately, even though they did gain independence from Spain, there was no unity and also no social revolution. So what this meant was that the Creole elites ended up dominating new South American nations. There was independence, but those Creoles, the people who had pure Spanish or Portuguese blood, in this case Spanish blood, they ended up dominating and owning property and owning plantations and basically owning people until the 20th century. And there wasn't any real democracy until the 1900s. So another 100 years practically. So Mexico gained independence in 1821, and let's take a look at this territory. It goes all the way down and all the way into, halfway into the United States, halfway into Texas, and all the way up above California. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Mexican-American War. It lasted a couple years, and these territories that you see demarcated here are really important to note. The United States said that they owned territory all the way to the Rio Grande River, which is right down here, the Rio Grande. However, Mexico said that they owned up to the Nueces River here and all along this border. And this territory here that is kind of surrounded in a green marker, should I call it, was considered disputed territory between the United States and Mexico, which again, Mexico had gained independence in 1821. So we're talking 25 years later. And the United States gained this whole chunk of territory here from France after 1803. And so this was kind of fairly new territory to the United States as well, but the United States is also still pretty new, so everything's kind of new in this sense. But this green surrounded territory here is disputed territory, and when you have disputed territory, you're not supposed to put military into a territory like that. Well, the United States' president, President Polk, knows this, and he knows if he sends his troops into this territory, Mexico will likely retaliate and attack. And that's exactly what he does because he wants to fight Mexico. He knows that the Mexican military is not half as organized as the United States military is, and the United States will win not only this territory that is surrounded in green here, the disputed territory, but they will also likely win all the way to California, including New Mexico and parts of Texas. So what happens? That's exactly what happens. President Polk puts troops, American Army troops, into this disputed territory. Mexico attacks. 11 American soldiers are killed, and it is considered disputed territory. However, President Polk says, no, this isn't disputed territory, this is American territory. Congress votes and almost unanimously decides to go to war against Mexico. There were several people, however, who didn't like this idea, including people like Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, a former slave. And they don't want to go to war because they want the young men who would be fighting in this war to help build up America and not to tear down and die. However, let's see here, we talked about all this. This war ends in what is called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And U.S. ended up gaining Utah, Nevada, California, Western Colorado, Texas, and parts of Arizona and New Mexico. So a lot more than even what President Polk originally wanted. And they got all of this territory, 500,000 square miles, in exchange for $15 million, which was about $30 a mile, a square mile, which is really such a tiny, tiny, tiny drop in the bucket for what this land is worth, even at the time, what it was worth at the time. And this was considered manifest destiny. It was white man's destiny by God to go and conquer this territory. Otherwise, God would have made it impossible. So it's just kind of interesting to think about. And this is what, 160 years ago? It's kind of amazing to think what we have done in our history in America. Gaining this land was a huge problem in the future because slavery became a really, really big issue. As we have discussed a little bit already, slaves aren't emancipated until after the American Civil War, which starts in 1865. So we have another almost 20 years of debates and challenges within the United States in regard to slavery. And now the United States has acquired this humongous chunk of land, and they don't know what to do with it. A lot of the states end up becoming slave states, unfortunately. So here's an up-close map. The green is the United States, And the blue and green stripes is the disputed territory. This is the Rio Grande down here, and this is the Nueces River here. And the United States not only gains this disputed territory, but all of this territory as well. Up here you see a star where the Bear Flag Revolt took place in 1846. That was a group of Americanos, or Americans, excuse me, who went and conquered the land, fighting against the Mexicans. The Mexicans technically won the battle because they killed more people, but the Americans ended up staying there, and they called themselves a California Republic. And they even created a flag, which became the California flag with the bear and the star. Eventually, soon after, actually, the United States took over and said, "You are going to become our California battalion," and they kept the territory. And this was in 1846, towards the beginning of the Mexican-American War. And they kept the territory because it was so strategic. It offered so much access to both rivers and ocean that it was deemed too important to give back to Mexico. And one more thing to note, all of the Mexicans living in this territory were promised that if they can prove that the land was theirs, that they would be able to keep it. And so many people got lawyers and went to court and managed to figure out a way to prove that the territory was theirs. And most Mexicans won, meaning that they proved that the territory was theirs. However, due to the court fees and the lawyers, who usually were white, that they had to pay, they ended up losing because they had so much debt to pay to prove that the land was theirs, that after the courts they couldn't even afford to keep the land and they had to sell and leave, which is again one more sort of shocking thing that went on between Mexico and the United States. We are going to finish up this Unit 5 in class, and we're going to discuss the abolition of slavery and how it really reflected the ideas of the Revolution.